I used most of the Sony A7S III's features on my engagement video that I shot a few weeks ago. Today we're going to be breaking down that video and talking about why I love this camera so much. If you want to go watch the full video uninterrupted, the link is down below. For the shoot, of course, I used the Sony A7S III paired with the 24mm G Master 1.4. I shot everything in full manual, 4K, and I stuck to one codec, XAVC-HS. I used the highest bitrate that 420 10-bit allowed instead of 422 because it's just a little bit easier to deal with in post. For these types of talking head videos, I use the exact same setup, but I half the bitrate. I will also admit before we start that I really should know more about color grading than I do. I shot everything with no picture profile, and I probably lost some dynamic range. And capturing dynamic range is something that this camera is supposedly really good at. So I'm definitely not pushing the A7S III to its absolute limits for this video, but I still had to do some color and exposure correction, and I think it held up really nicely, and we'll go over that. So first things first is the thumbnail that I used for this video. It's actually just a screen grab of when I was actually proposing. And honestly, it looks fantastic. It does not look like a screen grab at all. It looks like a native photo that I took. I was even able to put it into Lightroom and lighten it up just a touch. Bring up the shadows, bring down the highlights, bump up the saturation a little bit, and made it pop just a little bit more. And this is a screen grab. It's insane. There's so much detail in this 4K screen grab. I'm super impressed. So first shot of the video is actually me on top of the mountain right before I'm about to propose. I was actually using 60 frames per second at this time, but earlier in the day, I was only using 24 and it was a mistake. There was definitely some times when I was editing the video that I wish I had 60 frames to slow it down a little bit. Also, you can hear how everything's clipping a little bit, and that's why I put the subtitles at the bottom. It was super windy, and obviously I had a lot of things going through my mind, what I'm gonna say, and I didn't check to see if I was peaking on the audio levels. To make it work, I put some subtitles underneath to make sure that everyone can understand what I'm saying, brought down the volume, had the music bumped up, and that kind of masked it a little bit for sure. Also, we had a small color correction on this shot. I was definitely way overexposed, and I think I bumped up the saturation by 5%, not very big. You can't really see the saturation, it's mostly the exposure. I just brought down those midtones, the exposure, and it turned out to be a decent shot that isn't super overexposed. I mean, the sky and the snow is definitely quite bright, but still lots of detail. You can see everything that's going on. I'm nervous. And then this is S&Q. This is a great little feature in the camera. The detail in this is just as good as a regular video, and it's so easy. The only limitation is that the slowest you can go is 1 frame per second. And when you're taking a time lapse, usually you want to be able to go definitely a little bit slower than 1 frame per second, a frame every 2 seconds, a frame every 3 seconds. 1 frame every 1 second is still good, but sometimes you definitely want a little bit more time to pass. I actually sped this up even further, but it turned out really nicely. I really like the shot, establishing where we are. We're in Canmore, April 2021. It's beautiful. Nothing much to say about this shot besides I zoom into 175% and you can very clearly read even the smallest letters on this board. That's just, even though it's a 12 megapixel camera and it's not downsampling from like 6K like other 24 megapixel cameras, you still get so much definition with the 4K. It still looks so nice.
Bowl is the goal.
Bowl is the goal.
What should I say? That there's a lot of snow and I'm very worried.
Are you very worried that there's going to be a lot of snow?
Yes, very worried.
Don't be worried.
So another thing to know about this video, I used active stabilization almost the entire time, except for the times when I was shooting 120 frames per second and active stabilization doesn't work. I actually also used Catalyst Browse a little bit later, and we'll talk about that then. But you can see in this shot, like, I mean, it's not perfect. I mean, I'm walking. I'm trying to ninja walk as best as I can, but it's still definitely turning out quite smooth. Some jitters here and there, and that's one thing I don't like about IBIS, is it has like these mechanical shifts. It's not this natural hand motion. It's these kind of like jars very quickly as the sensor gets moved too far from its area of where it's trying to stabilize. However, like I said, super happy with how it turned out anyways. Sometimes Final Cut Pro stabilization does help in these situations. Sometimes it doesn't. In this case, active stabilization does help to make this clip a little bit better. I had to turn down the translation smooth all the way down because on its stock setting, you get that major wobble, which looks far less professional than having some camera jitter. You can just see how the mountains just keep shifting back and forth. So after I played around with it, turning down transition smooth definitely kept some extra smoothing out, but got rid of that super wobble. As far as the light exposure correction I did, I mean, there definitely wasn't too much going on. I just probably brought down the mid-tones a little bit just to make those trees pop a little bit more. But obviously I blew out the sky and there's just none of that information left. However, it was a very gray and cloudy day. So if that was nice and blue sky, it may have definitely looked less blown out. And if I shot in S-Log3, got a little bit more dynamic range, probably would have captured a little bit more of that data inside the clouds to get a little bit more of that definition. But like I said, you can basically see this area here in the side. That's not blown out fully, but it's still completely gray, and that's just because of the gray day. Now, even though I didn't shoot an S-Log3, to put these clips together, I think they flow quite nicely as far as looking similarly, but without the exposure correction, they look a lot different. This one was shot way underexposed, and then this shot was way overexposed. So as you go from one to the other, it's quite jarring, the difference, especially from the clip before. Definitely a lot darker. Having that 10-bit, I believe, and being able to move the exposure a little bit more, I was definitely able to tie these clips a little bit better together and make it look more seamless.
So we're gonna cramp on right away.
Here's another situation where Final Cut Pro stabilization really helped out without introducing too much wobble. Active stabilization did okay, but if we watch it now without Final Cut Pro stabilization, it is a lot more shaky. And putting that stabilization on definitely helped a lot.
So do you feel better, dear, with those?
Yeah.
You look like a true hiker, that's
I looked at
There's some vibration in the trees I can see, but as far as huge wobbles, not quite there.
Yeah, a couple issues. It's a lot icier than we thought it would be.
Another thing I should probably mention is that I used the D80 D3 Pro instead of using the internal mic for a A7S III video breakdown. Probably would have been better for me to use the internal one, see how it held up, but obviously for this case, I wanted to capture the best audio I possibly could. And by the way, all the links to the lens, the camera, the microphone, all those things I used will be down in the description below. For this entire video, I actually used autofocus the entire time. For this one specifically, I had wide on with the eye tracking, and it kept me in focus the entire time, even though I'm shaking the camera, moving it forward and back just ever so slightly. Kept me in perfectly, no hunting whatsoever. It held really well. And for this ring animation, I actually shot the ring sparkling at 120 frames per second at home in the light, and then used Photoshop to cut out the sparkle so that the sparkle of the ring was actually real. It wasn't something I added. You can also see I'm using that wonderful articulating screen that the Sony A7S III has. Instead of looking at the lens, I'm looking right at the screen, which is such a rookie move, but it is what it is. It doesn't look too bad, but I just wanted to say that that articulating screen on the A7S III is very useful, especially when you want to talk to the camera. When you want to get those low shots, those high shots, being able to move that screen up or down, super helpful.
Love you.
For all these shots that I have are walking towards me, I have wide and eye tracking autofocus on, but the shots that I'm behind her and trying to keep focus on her, I just used the large focus zone, kept it on her, and I don't think there's one time in this entire video where the camera is hunting for focus. This is the first 120 frame per second shot that I have. I'm using that large zone autofocus and just having that box on her, and you can see as she starts to walk away from the camera, it's not hunting back and forth. It keeps locked on her the entire time. And in this 120 frame per second shot, you can see it looks exactly the same as the other frame rates. there is absolutely no loss in detail with shooting 120 frames per second. You do get that 1.1 times crop, effectively using the entire sensor, but looking at this shot and comparing it to the 60 frames per second and the 24 frames per second, it doesn't look any different.
If there weren't kids around, I would yell that TikTok video. Yeah, baby. White Claw.
Root canal yesterday.
Once again, that super overexposed sky definitely would have been helpful to have that blue sky. However, if I did shoot for the highlights and brought the exposure up in post, I probably could have got a little more detail, as well as, of course, using S-Log3, getting as much dynamic range as possible.
Climb a mountain today. Bowl is the goal.
Bowl is the goal.
This is probably my favorite shot of the entire video. It's so dynamic, there's so much movement that I'm doing. Of course, I have slow motion on, active stabilization on the camera, and then throwing it into stabilization on Final Cut Pro. But there's so much going on, so much movement from me, from her. She's staying in focus. Things look like they're almost like on a gimbal. It looks great. I love this shot. But if you go and turn off Final Cut Pro stabilization, you can see how much data it had to use to stabilize the shot. But you know what? The mountain's still cropped in. We lose it a little bit at the top there. Move down to show how far we are. And then back to her. Definitely lose a lot there, but I feel it really brings attention to her, which I like a lot better. And of course, that beautiful face, that beautiful smile. Another opportunity that I probably could have cut a little better to the beat of her walking.
Checkpoint number 1. And it's beautiful. So
Not much to say about this shot either. But you can see for the shot, I have no exposure correction,
Feeling a little.
no color correction. I mean, I probably could have bumped up the saturation a little bit, but I think the skin tones look good. The atmosphere looks good. I think the colors look great for no picture profile, straight out of camera.
Great time.
And we move into this shot where I'm using Catalyst Browse for the first time, and it looks very smooth. It's steep. She's using poles. I'm holding a camera. I'm obviously shifting all the way around. The camera's moving everywhere, but comparing this shot processed through Catalyst Browse, comparing it to non-stabilized, it's night and day. Of course, I'm not using the 180-degree shutter rule, but this clip is 6 seconds. It moves on so quick, it doesn't give the viewer enough time to be like, hey, something's wrong here. The shutter speed is wrong. The motion blur that I'm used to is not there. Why is it not there? For a keen eye, maybe you can see it. I can't see it. Of course, slowing it down a little bit helps. Here's another one where I'm moving. I'm going up steps. This terrain is not easy to be walking. It's icy. All I have is ice cleats that are kind of keeping me locked to the mountain while holding this camera, both hands, trying to get smooth footage, trying not to fall, trying not to slip. Catalyst Browse came in really nicely to smooth out this footage, and honestly, I wish I used it a little bit more throughout the video. And here's another situation where I'm so happy with how it looks straight out of the camera. There is no color correction. There's no exposure correction. I think this looks very nice. I think that blue sky looks nice. The trees look green. There's detail in the clouds. No picture profile. And this is how it looks.
I'm very happy that we didn't give up in like minute 1, like I was considering, that's for sure.
So there's not much to say about this part. Here's where I kind of transitioned from trying to make a very pleasing film to the sappy cameras on the tripod, me proposing. So there's not much to talk about besides you can see there's definitely lots of times where we are looking at each other and the focus is still on my face. It's still there. If you watch the full video, there are a few instances where it starts to hunt just for a second, but then it goes right back and locks on the eye. I didn't tear up proposing, but watching this over and over again gets me almost every time. She was very happy, very surprised. She had absolutely no idea this was happening. And we've been together for 10 years, so it was a long time coming. She's been asking for this for so long, yet somehow I still was able to surprise her with her absolutely having no idea that this was coming. But I'm just gonna fast forward here because, I mean, we just don't need to watch it all here. But there is one thing that I wanna just bring here is, you can see here I have absolutely no stabilization. Camera's shaky, but you know what? It doesn't look terrible. It's, you know, she's still there. You can still focus on her face. It kind of looks natural. And then here's active stabilization. And honestly, it does look way better. But no, stabilization still doesn't look too bad when you're just standing there. And actually, thankfully for me, thankfully for this video, we can see the exact moment it goes from no stabilization to active stabilization. And you can see how much it totally helps. Shaky, shaky, shaky. Boom. Locked on. So much clearer looking at her face. It looks so much better. Anyways, if you want to have a good tear up, go watch the full video. A lot of people that don't really know us as well that saw the video said they had a little cry. And for me, as the video maker, obviously that's the emotion I'm trying to invoke in my viewer. So I feel like it worked out really well. So that's the Sony A7S III in the wild, shooting a real video instead of just comparisons, looking at charts. And I think it's an amazing camera. It has so many features, so many different ways to shoot, so many codecs, frame rates, color, everything. This camera has it all. So if you're on the fence about buying this camera, know that it is a professional camera that will give you professional results. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.